Hello and welcome back to our discussion of metabolism. So we just looked at insulin and glucagon, which regulate metabolism and particularly plasma glucose on a moment-to-moment basis. Now what we're going to do is we're going to start looking at some hormones that regulate metabolism on kind of a longer term basis. And we are going to start with the adrenal glucocorticoids. Okay, so the adrenal glucocorticoids are made by the adrenal gland. So I want to start by reminding you about the adrenal gland. Okay, so we have two adrenal glands, one that sits on top of each kidney. The adrenal gland consists of an outer part, the cortex, and an inner part, the medulla. Okay, we're going to be focusing today on the cortex, which is where our adrenal glucocorticoids are made. Okay, so here are some things to note about the adrenal glucocorticoids. They are secreted by the adrenal cortex, like I just mentioned. They're going to be mediating long-term stress responses. And they also have metabolic effects, which we will also be talking about, actually mostly be talking about. And the main glucocorticoid is cortisol, which you have heard of, which we've made reference to kind of towards the beginning of this class. So now we're going to learn a little bit more about it. Cortisol and actually all of the adrenal glucocorticoids are steroid hormones. Okay, so remember those are made from cholesterol. Here is cortisol right here. Based on the fact that cortisol is a steroid hormone, let's see if you remember your steroid hormone characteristics. Let's see if you can answer these questions. Would you expect cortisol to be stored in vesicles? How would you expect it to be transported in the blood? And what kind of receptor would you expect it to bind? So go ahead and think about that for a moment. Hit pause if you need to. Okay, so hopefully you were able to remember that steroid hormones such as cortisol are not able to be stored in vesicles because they can easily cross membranes. Cortisol is going to be transported in the blood with the assistance of a carrier protein to help make it more soluble in the blood. Okay, and cortisol, being a steroid hormone, is going to bind an intracellular receptor and lead to more long-term responses in the cell, such as changes in transcription and translation. Shown here is the control pathway for cortisol secretion. Okay, so starting up here, we have the hypothalamus making CRH, or corticotropin releasing hormone. CRH is going to stimulate the anterior pituitary to make ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone. And adrenocorticotropic hormone in turn is going to stimulate the adrenal cortex to make cortisol. We're going to have our long loop negative feedback pathways as you would normally expect. I also want to point out that this pathway is affected by circadian rhythms. So cortisol secretion tends to be higher in the morning. It kind of dips at noon and goes back up in the afternoon and falls at night. Okay, and also that this pathway is stimulated by stress. Okay, so let's tell you a few things about cortisol. Cortisol, I'm going to start down here. Cortisol is essential for life. You cannot live without cortisol. Almost every cell in the body has cortisol receptors, every nucleated cell in the body. Okay, so cortisol is going to have very wide-ranging effects in the body. We don't really understand a lot of them. So here I'm just going to focus on a certain few responses. Okay, one of the main actions of cortisol is to prevent hypoglycemia, or low blood sugar. Okay. And I also just want to mention that cortisol is necessary for glucagon to have its full effects. So in the last slide show, you learned about glucagon. It actually can't have its full actions without the presence of cortisol. Okay, so that said, what I'd like you to do now is to consider this point in particular, the fact that cortisol is going to be preventing hypoglycemia. Based on that, let's see if you can answer these questions here. Would you expect cortisol to have anabolic or catabolic effects? Second question, what response would you expect cortisol to have at each of these targets? So don't worry about the immune system, but the liver, the muscle, and the adipose tissue. So go ahead and hit pause, and when you're ready, you can come back to that. Okay, so hopefully you were able to figure out cortisol is going to have catabolic effects, okay? So when our blood sugar gets low, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to tap into our storage molecules, break them down to free up glucose and bring blood sugar back up, okay? At each of these targets, these are the responses that you would expect to see, basically catabolic responses. We're going to be taking our large storage molecules and breaking them down into smaller molecules. So in the liver, that's going to take the form of gluconeogenesis. In the muscle, that's going to take the form of protein catabolism, protein breakdown. In the adipose tissue, that's going to take the form of lipolysis or fat breakdown. Okay. One other main effect of cortisol is to suppress the immune system. Okay. And that's not something I expected you to be able to tell at all because we haven't really talked about the immune system. But this may be familiar to you. So, when someone gets an injury, for example, a lot of times they will get cortisol shots or some kind of medication. Um, that's like a steroid hormone that is related to cortisol that mimics the effects of cortisol. Um, and the idea there is to kind of down regulate inflammation or to prevent inflammation at the injury, or, often cortisol or other steroid medications are used to prevent inflammation for other reasons as well. Okay, last slide. I just want to close this little section on cortisol by letting you know that there's this figure in your book that kind of summarizes the actions of cortisol. I'm not going to go over it, and I'm not sure that you really need to know everything in here, but it does cover many of the basics.